So we've talked about how difficult it can be to get a handle on the Irish mythological cycle, how it's full of supernatural vagaries, informational gaps, and conflicting sources, but we also talked about how worthwhile it is to mine for material. And now it's time for us to prove it. Let's delve into what may be the most significant text in the entire mythological cycle, the Liber Gabála Éireann, better known as the Book of Invasions. The tale of Ireland's first settler is not particularly long and, in all honesty, not particularly impressive. Her name was Kesser, and she was claimed to be the granddaughter of Noah, the one with the ark. For whatever reason, she was unable to secure a place aboard for her and her people, so instead of becoming resigned to her fate, she brought them aboard 3 ships of her own and struck out in search of a safe haven. Eventually, they settled on the island that would one day become Ireland. Unfortunately, by the time they landed, they'd somehow lost 2 of their ships. Even worse, the one ship that actually managed to make shore was only carrying 3 men and 49 women. For a while, they were able to make things work, sharing the men equally amongst themselves. But when 2 of them died, leaving Kesser's husband, Fintan MacBocra, to care for the whole 49 of them, he collapsed under the pressure and retreated into the water in the form of a salmon. We don't know how exactly he changed shape like that, but whatever it was, it allowed him to survive the Great Deluge while the rest perished. He then went on to live out the next 5,500 years in the form of each species of animal on Ireland, watching history unfold before him so that he could share it with us someday. Ireland's second settler was leagues more successful than its first. 300 years after the flood, Partholon arrived with his family and 1,000 of his people, and they were civilized. They brought with them customs like cooking, plowing, building stationary homes, cattle husbandry, trade, and they divided the island into 4 great regions whose names have since become lost to history. When they eventually fought Ireland's first battle at Mythological, they bested the Fomorian chieftain Cichol Renos and his monstrous ranks. After that, they prospered for more than 500 years. By all accounts, they could have become the ancestors of Ireland's modern inhabitants, if not for one slip-up. For some reason, they all just happened to be gathered together at the plain of Senmai when they were set upon by a plague. The sickness spread so quickly through their numbers that, by the end of a single week, not one of them was left standing. 5,000 men and 4,000 women. Not one lived, save perhaps for a man named Tuan Macirol, whose story is almost identical to Fintan's. He too escaped death in the form of a salmon, and he too wandered Ireland for centuries in the shapes of its creatures. And finally, something stuck. After the 2 failures before him, Nemed arrived as Ireland's 3rd and most successful settler thus far. Save for the Fomorians, who always just seemed to be there, Nemed's people were the first to inhabit Ireland without dying out completely. That isn't to say they had an easy go of things, though. After leaving from the Caspian Sea with 44 ships and drifting for more than a year, they landed with just 1 ship carrying Nemed, his family, and a few others. His wife died within 12 days ashore, but somehow they still managed to establish themselves enough to defeat the Fomorians in 4 different battles. That might have secured their place on the island if a plague hadn't fallen on Nemed and 3,000 of his people only 9 years after their arrival. The Fomorians seized the opportunity, and the 2 Fomorian kings, Conan and Mork, began to exact attacks on the Nemedians. 2/3 of all their corn, 2/3 of all their milk, and 2/3 of all their children. Eventually, the people rose up in great numbers and overwhelmed Conan in his tower, where he was killed. In retaliation, Mork called a tidal wave that wiped out all but 30 of them. Defeated but not dead, they left the island in search of better things. Some went inland to Britain, some went south to Greece, and a number of them went into the north of the world. So, I said some of the Nemedians went to Greece in search of better things. Well, they didn't find it. The 230 years they spent there were spent in chains. It wasn't until the Israelite exodus from Egypt that they had the numbers to escape back to Ireland. And even then, by the time they went back, they weren't the same people. They had become the Fir Bolg, the men of the bag. Whether this name comes from their time as slaves hauling sacks of dirt, or from the fabled sacks of soil they brought to Ireland to change the stony terrain into hospitable earth, that's unclear. But however they came to be, they were better off for it. Uncontested by the Fomorians, they thrived and divided up Ireland into its 5 provinces, North and South Munster, Ulster, Leinster, and Connaught. To preside over them, they established a high kingship, which lasted for 37 years and saw the rule of 7 different kings. The short succession ended with the rule of a man named Tuatha Dé Danann, said to be the example of a perfect king. But it seems that even perfect is not enough to save one from the gods. As you'll recall, when the remainder of Nemed's people dispersed, a number of them traveled into the mysterious north. We have no idea what that means exactly, but we do know that wherever it was, it brought them under the guidance of the goddess Danu, who sent them to learn in the 4 mythical cities of knowledge, Gorias, Phineas, Murias, and Phalias. By the time they were done with their training, they were no longer the tribe of Nemed. They were something more. The tribe of the goddess Danu, the Tuatha Dé Danann. With their new godlike abilities, they returned to Ireland to reclaim their home. The first order of business, of course, was to wrestle it from the Fir Bolg, a conflict which became the First Battle of Mythology, during which the arm of Nuada, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was severed. Since he was no longer perfect, he was no longer fit to rule, and so the throne was passed to the half-Fomorian prince, Bres. Bres was as beautiful as he was greedy, and favored his Fomorian kin. Before long, the Tuatha were living in what amounted to slavery, paying taxes and using their powers for menial labor. After 7 years of this, Dinkecht, healer of the Tuatha, created for Nuada a silver arm, with which he was able to reclaim the throne and depose Bres. Cast aside and bitter, Bres sought help from the Fomorian champion, Balor of the Baleful Eye. Together, with the might of the Fomorian armies at their back, they waged a war against the Tuatha Dé Danann, the second battle of Mythology, which claimed the lives of Nuada and Balor and many others before the Tuatha came out victorious and began their 200-year reign. This period accounts for the bulk of the mythological cycle, as most stories in it, such as the wooing of Iten and the children of Lir, revolve around the exploits of the Tuatha Dé Danann. As it does in most stories, in order for the time of man to begin, the time of gods and magic eventually has to come to an end. And the end came with the arrival of Ireland's 6th and final mythological invaders, the Milesians. They didn't just emerge from the fog to crash the party, though. They actually have a really interesting history with heavy connections to other historical events, mostly biblical, naturally. Their ancestors are said to have aided in the construction of the Tower of Babel, invented the Gaelic language, and they escaped slavery in Egypt alongside the Israelites. After that, they wandered the world for 440 years before eventually conquering Spain. From there, they discovered Ireland and sent a small party to explore. The Milesians were received well by the kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann, but before they could return to Spain, a mysterious third party murdered the Milesian prince I, who had been sent as an envoy, which inevitably sparked a war between the two peoples. Oddly enough, the godlike figures turned out to be no match for the new invaders, and were quickly forced to seek terms. In the end, they were allowed to stay, but only beneath the Shia Mounds. And so it was that the great deities of Ireland became the Aes Shi, who in turn became nothing more than Irish fairies. Now this is definitely the abridged version of the Book of Invasions. We really recommend you do some digging on your own. But even here in this chopped up, super condensed version, you can begin to see the loose threads waiting for someone to spin them into stories. Like, where did the Fomorians come from? What are they? And how did Fintan and Tuan do their shapeshifting thing? How were the Milesians able to overcome the godlike Tuatha Dé Danann? And most curious of all, what about the North? What was it like? How did Danu and the Four Cities produce demigods, and could it be done again? All good fodder for new fiction. Hopefully something in there sparks your imagination. If it does, feel free to write something up and send it to us. Just click that submit button at the end. Anyway, we've got our own story to write, so that's it for this list. In the meantime, if you want to support the channel and get in on special updates and sneak peeks, you can join us over on Patreon. As always, thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. We'll see you next week. Bye!